Welcome to Westminster, Kensington and Chelsea's Educational Psychology Consultation Services short webinar series. This webinar has been developed by educational psychologists within the service and is one of 4 webinars focusing on themes within education, child and community psychology. This webinar is titled Helping Children to Understand and Manage Their Feelings and is 25 minutes long. You may find it useful to pause the video to complete any suggested tasks, or to read some of the information contained on the slides. Links to the other titles in this series can be found in the description below.
Hello, my name is Alexander Haswell and I'm an educational and child psychologist for WKC Educational Psychology Consultation Service, and myself and my colleagues Trevor Sim and Dr. Louise Edgington have come up with this webinar to look at how we can help children to understand and manage their feelings, and we're going to be doing that by looking at the technique of emotion coaching. So when we're thinking about how to help children self-regulate and manage their emotional responses and therefore their behaviour, well, in my view, emotion coaching is a great way of doing that. It was originally developed as a parenting strategy by Dr. John Gottman, the psychologist in the United States. And yeah, he originally came up with it as a parenting strategy, but increasingly it's being used in education settings. And he developed it as an approach which can be learned by anybody who interacts with children and young people when they're struggling to control their emotional responses. Emotion coaching is an approach that focuses on the development of emotional regulation through supportive relationships. And this bit is key. We're going to be talking a lot about that later. It considers all emotions to be natural and normal. Again, we're going to be talking about that very soon. But it does recognize that they need to be expressed constructively and appropriately. And it also communicates to the child that it is safe to engage in problem solving. It works with the child to help them think, well, what could I do next time I'm feeling these strong emotions? So when we're looking at the key principles of emotion coaching, I mentioned it before, all emotions are natural. This is key. All emotions are normal, and they've all evolved to help us to adapt our behavior to support our survival. Now, when we're thinking about this phrase, all emotions are natural and all emotions are normal, you will often, if we have a look at this rainbow here and we imagine that each of these different colours represents a different emotion, we sometimes hear people talking about negative emotions. Often the ones that we think of as maybe on this end of the scale, the red ones, the hot ones, maybe things like anger. Oftentimes people talk about sadness as being quite a negative emotion, when of course there is really no such thing as a negative emotion. The emotion coaching approach really views all emotions as natural, as I say, and really in quite a neutral way. All of them have equal importance, but it's the way that they are expressed that is important. They need to be expressed constructively, they need to be expressed appropriately. Now, as part of our survival mechanism, we have evolved 2 systems that help us to regulate stressful experiences. So the first of these is the stress response system, and the second is the social engagement system. I'm going to look at both of those in a second. And it takes time and experience to learn how to manage and balance those 2 systems together. Now, the stress response system is something you're probably all familiar with. You will have no doubt come across this concept of the fight, flight, freeze response. This is our stress response system kicking in. It developed when our survival was being threatened. In our evolutionary past, these were kind of very primitive, automatic, physical responses that primed us to defend ourselves against perceived threats. Now, if you're thinking about a child, you will see these sometimes exhibited in children. So when we're thinking about the fight response, well, a child might sometimes physically lash out and hit another child or hit you or fight back. When we think about the flight response, maybe they'll try and run out of school or run out of the room. They're trying to flee the situation. Or maybe they'll stand there rather frozen and not say very much. Well, that might be the freeze response. What's interesting, of course, about these responses is we see them in ourselves as well as adults. They might come out differently, but if you imagine somebody coming up to you and criticizing you quite strongly, well, you might feel the need to fight back. Maybe not physically, but you may very well criticize the other person back or seek to defend yourself. Well, that would be the fight response. Or you might just get up and walk away from the conversation and leave the room. Well, that would be the flee response. You're trying to just get out of the situation to protect yourself. Or you might just feel very frozen and not say very much and feel rather paralyzed. Well, that would be the freeze response. So these are all automatic physical responses that are part of our evolutionary history to help us protect ourselves against perceived threats. But of course, these responses aren't always appropriate to the situations we find ourselves in. Now, the second system that I talked about evolving is the social engagement system. And this has evolved to balance out the stress response system that we just looked at. And it comes about through human contact. It's human contact which helps engage our social engagement system. It helps it to activate and kick in, and it helps the stress response to calm down. But the social engagement system is developed, yes, through human contact, and a very kind of specific kind of human contact, a kind we call attunement. We're talking about a tuned relationship with others. This is a very important concept which we're going to be looking at, and which really emotion coaching is all about. It's all about fostering these attuned relationships. So when we look at this picture of the adult and the child here, when children are born, you'll see caregivers attune themselves to their child. The adult will try and work out how the child is feeling and try and work out what's going on in the child's internal world. And so there's a sense that the adult is tuning in, rather like a radio, to the child, tuning into their frequency, trying to work out what's going on for them. And the reason this is so important is that over time, this helps the child to begin to understand themselves. Now, the key principles of emotion coaching, I kind of touched on it earlier. All emotions are natural and normal. Not always a matter of choice. This is key, I think. We often talk about the language of choice with children. So you'll often see, I know I've seen in schools sometimes, where a child is overwhelmed with emotion maybe, and it comes out in inappropriate behaviour. And later on, there's a sort of reflection time between the adult and the child. And the adult will talk a lot about choice. Did you make a good choice or a bad choice? What choice could you have made? All of those kind of things. What's interesting about that, of course, is that it presupposes that the child is consciously aware of what they're doing, that they were in a position to be able to make a choice. Whereas, of course, if these are the things which are kicking in, the stress response system, the fight, flight, freeze response, well, they're not really making a choice in that moment. It's automatic. Maybe later on they can reflect upon that, but were they making a choice? Was it conscious? Maybe not. Because we need to remember that challenging behaviour is often the result of a child or young person struggling to regulate their emotions because they're feeling overwhelmed. All of us know that feeling. We can only take on board so much, and sometimes everything just spills out. So rather than maybe talk about choice with children who are struggling with their emotions and behaviour, I think a better way round to do it is to really try and help the child to understand their feelings and emotions and help them begin to regulate that so that in future they can make different choices. On to the next principle here, emotional first aid. I love this concept. I remember a teacher once said to me in a school when we were talking about this, they said, isn't it interesting that when a child cuts their finger and hurts themselves, we rush over with the first aid kit and we try and soothe the wound. But when a child is having an emotional moment, maybe everything's spilling out in a very inappropriate way, we don't often offer emotional first aid, but really that's what's needed first, calming, soothing. And the last principle here, which I just want to cover, vitally important, and I kind of mentioned it a bit earlier, but it's really important to remember that children cannot successfully self-regulate their emotions unless they have experienced and internalized co-regulation. And now we're back to the idea again of attunement, because that's what we mean when we talk about co-regulation. An adult tuning in and empathizing with the child's emotional state and thus containing the child's emotional state. This is vitally important. When you think about a child maybe in your school or at home who struggles to sit still all the time, we can have a target for that child that, okay, they need to sit still for 5 minutes or they need to sit still for 10 minutes. But it presupposes the child is able to do that and that the child is even aware that they're not sitting still. As I say, the first step really needs to be in helping the child to tune into the child and help the child understand how they feel so that they can actually begin to regulate that behavior. Because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about self-regulation. Now, if you look at the aims of emotion coaching, they're very interesting because, of course, a child can achieve all the academic grades in the world and that may help them achieve their career goals and everything else. But if we think about the life skills you're going to really need to be personally fulfilled, and I would argue really professionally fulfilled, you're going to need these skills. And this is what emotion coaching aims to do, to help children to empathize, to read the emotions and social cues of others, to help them control their impulses, to self-regulate, to delay gratification. Yes, patience, very important skill. To help children to learn to motivate themselves and to cope with life's ups and downs. So these skills, which we're trying to help children develop through emotion coaching, I think are fundamentally important to their future well-being, future development. Now, before we get on to what emotion coaching actually is, because I'm going to go through it with you very practically, step by step, I just want to pause for a second to think about how we deal with our own emotions and those of others. So while you're listening to this, I want you to kind of just reflect upon your own self without judgment. I'm going to ask you to do that without judgment because we want to practice what we preach here. And just to sort of be compassionate with yourself and think about the different ways that you sometimes deal with your own emotions and those of others. Because when we think about it, the way that we all manage our emotions was really influenced by the emotional responses of our parents and caregivers, the environment we grew up in. What did we see the adults do around us in terms of how they dealt with their own emotions and ours? We can really split the different styles of how people deal with emotions into 4 kind of categories. So the first of these would be the disapproving style. And a disapproving style believes that expressing emotions is a sign of weakness. So it tries to get rid of those, I mentioned them earlier, those so-called negative emotions via discipline, reprimand, blame, shame, punishment, those kind of things. Now, a dismissive style is slightly different. Subtly different, really, because it again is trying to suppress those emotions, those so-called negative emotions, but it does it in a different way. It does it by reducing them, minimizing them, making light of their importance. So we've all heard these kind of phrases here. It's no big deal, be a big girl, boys don't cry, you'll be fine, don't be so sensitive, those kind of phrases. Interestingly, the other way we can inadvertently, I think, dismiss other people's emotions, and I've sometimes been guilty of this and really had to reflect upon it, is when somebody's going through an emotional moment and we kind of jump in to rescue them. We jump in to make them feel better. We try and almost take away what the person is feeling and G them up. But the problem is when we do that is that we're actually, without realizing it, sometimes minimizing what the person is feeling and actually then dismissing it, which can be very frustrating for the person who's experiencing the emotion. What they maybe need from us in that moment is for us to sit and let them experience whatever emotion they're feeling without jumping in to need to rescue them or take them away from it. Third style here, the laissez-faire style, well, this doesn't set any limits on behaviour, offers little to no guidance about problem solving or understanding emotion. So it really is a case of anything goes. And this is also not helpful in cultivating sort of emotional regulation. And so the style which we're trying to use here and cultivate is the emotion coaching style, which considers all emotions to be normal and natural, but does recognise they need to be expressed constructively and appropriately. And as I said earlier, it communicates that it is safe to engage in problem solving. So now, moving on to the steps of emotion coaching. This slide here is just an overview. We're going to be going into each of the steps in more detail. But just so you've got an overview here, what we're encouraging you to do is to, first of all, become aware of the emotion in the child. So this is an internal step for you. You don't need to do anything active at this point. It's just you being internally aware that a child in my class or in my home is experiencing something. And you are going to then communicate your understanding and acceptance of that emotion. And step 2, you're going to validate and label the emotions that you can see are being felt. So you're going to use words. Yes, you're going to use language to describe the feelings. Dan Siegel, the child psychiatrist in the United States, there's a link to his book underneath this video. He coined the phrase, name it to tame it. Very important concept. Very, very, it really works, Step 3, we're going to set limits if needed. So if the way the child is expressing their emotions is not inappropriate, then we don't need to set limits. But if it is inappropriate, then limits need to be set. This is really where we're communicating that all emotions and feelings are acceptable, but some behaviours are not. And lastly, we're going to help the child to solve problems. We're going to work with them to help them think about, well, what could I do next time I feel like this? How could I manage this differently? So looking at these steps in more detail, as I say, the first step is to recognise the child's feelings and empathise with them. This is an internal step. I'm going to ask you to do 2 things here, both of which are internal. The first is to recognise that the child is experiencing an emotional moment. Look for physical signs of the emotion being felt. Look for verbal signs of the emotion being felt. But equally importantly, again, this is an internal step. I want you to check what's going on for you. Has the child's behaviour touched a nerve for you? Has it made you feel something? Maybe you feel frustrated, maybe you feel angry, maybe you feel helpless, maybe you feel frightened. Check in with yourself. What are you feeling? And again, we want to practice what we preach. Try and do that and try and practice doing that without judgment. You don't need to be hard on yourself if you're feeling something. This is really about you self-regulating in this moment. Reflecting, grounding yourself, self-soothing, calming, reflecting on how you feel so that you can then choose the appropriate course of action and be ready for, hopefully, step 2, which is where you're going to validate and label the emotion that you can see the child is feeling. This is where you acknowledge its existence. Name the elephant in the room. You've all heard that phrase. This is what's being felt. This is what's going on. I'm going to name it. I'm not going to be afraid to name it. Sometimes we're afraid to name things because we think it might make something worse. Maybe a child is upset because they've suffered a bereavement, and we worry that if we talk about this, if we even mention it, it may make it worse. But actually, sometimes it's exactly what we need to name. The more we avoid things, sometimes the more potent they can become. So this whole idea of validating and labeling, what is the emotion I'm seeing here? And use words, use language to reflect back that emotion. And by being with the child as they're experiencing this emotion, this heightened state, you are communicating that you understand how they are feeling and that it's okay to feel like that. So this is that whole attunement we talked about earlier. This is a wonderful experience for the child to have. So some examples here. I can see you're frowning, you're kicking the wall, you're expressing a lot of energy right now. I'd be feeling like that too if I didn't want to do something. I noticed you looking around and struggling to sit still. I think you might be feeling nervous right now about your work. Have I got that right? It's okay to feel frustrated. I feel frustrated too right now. I can't do the things I used to like doing and I miss the way things were. It's all new and strange for us all. It's a good one for the pandemic, of course. And it's okay to have the feelings you're having. These are normal and natural. Now, all this is great so far. If we were to stop here, we would have already done fantastic work in helping the child to reflect upon how they feel, helping them feel this process of attunement going on, this sense that somebody understands them. But of course, we do need to set limits if the way the child has expressed their emotions is inappropriate. If the child is crying, then of course that's not inappropriate. But if it is coming out in ways that are unsafe or harmful for them or other people, or ways that, break your school rules, I'm sure you will have something like this up in your classrooms, or your home rules if you're a parent watching this, or a caregiver. It's really important to understand emotion coaching is absolutely not about ignoring the fact that some behaviours are not acceptable. It's saying that everything you feel is okay to feel. Everything you feel is okay to feel, but how we express that needs to be appropriate. So examples of how you might set limits. I understand you're feeling really sad today, but one of our golden rules is kindness. So calling your friend unkind names isn't an okay thing to do. Or I'm thinking you must be feeling really upset right now because you can't see all of your friends, but it's not okay to shout at me. Let's have a think about some different ways of staying in touch with your friends, which moves us very nicely on to problem solving. And this is key, because this is where we're going to reinforce the idea that children and young people have the capacity within themselves to develop skills to cope with their feelings and their emotional states. We're going to work with the child in this step to help the child think about, well, what could I do next time I feel like this? And wherever possible, and this is really important, we want those solutions to be driven by the child. We want them to be child-led. We want them to be active in this. But of course, there are times, especially when the child is new to the process or very young, when you're going to have to do a lot of modelling of this, especially initially. So some examples. I wonder whether it would be a good idea to go to the special beanbag in the corner next time you feel like this. Then I can come and help. Or what might help you calm down next time you feel like this? Or I can help you think of a different way to cope. And I like this one. Let's look to see what other people are doing to help them feel better and cope with this situation. And this is good for the pandemic again. We're all having to find new ways to manage how strange things feel right now. Of course, what I'd say about these steps, this is emotion coaching. This is what it is. It takes practice. You've got step 1 here, recognizing the child's feelings and empathizing with them, validating and labeling the emotions, setting limits if needed, and then problem solving. The examples I gave you, you want to find your own voice here and your own way of making this sound natural. These things aren't like a script. You don't have to say them like this. You might not want to sound too much like a psychologist. The reason these sound maybe quite like a psychologist is because I wrote them and that's what I do. I'm a psychologist, so almost can't help it. But you want to find your own voice, something that feels natural, organic, normal. Now, to help with emotion coaching, to help kind of support it, because if you're going to be using this with children, you want an environment around the child which cultivates emotional literacy generally. You want an environment where children feel they can talk about their emotions, where you talk about emotions, where there's that kind of vocabulary around, where it's sort of safe to do that. I think some of the activities that can really help support this whole process are things like having a place to calm down, such as a peaceful corner, and that's where a child or young person can go to regain their composure and reduce stimulation. you might have things in there like, a soft toy or picture books, or music or a jigsaw puzzle, or, therapy or plasticine, all calming activities. What we know is that when we're in a heightened state, often doing something very mundane like sorting or counting or these kind of very mundane activities can really help that stress response system we talked about earlier, can really help it calm down. You could also use a calm box. The child will work with the adult to choose activities that they will use when they notice that they're becoming upset or overexcited or nervous, and you can direct them at the beginning to select an activity when they're becoming dysregulated. What you want over time is for them to be able to notice when they're feeling a certain way and go to that calm box and take out an activity, take responsibility for soothing themselves. That will come in time, and then you really know you're getting somewhere with the self-regulation. Other activities, I love this one. It's one of my favorites, a mindful jar. And I like this because it can work really well as a physical and visual metaphor for everything we've been talking about here. So what you do is you get a jar and you put a big spoonful of glitter glue into it, and you fill it almost to the top with water, and then you put the lid back on, tighten it, and you shake that jar to make the glitter swirl around, and you talk to the children about how the glitter is like our thoughts and feelings when we're upset or angry, and describe how when it's whirling around it makes it really hard to see things clearly, and that's why all of us make different decisions when we're upset than we might if we could see things clearly, and this happens to all of us, so it's okay. And then you put the jar down in front of the children and you ask them to watch what happens when they're still for a while. Well, of course, the glitter starts to settle and the water clears. And you can tell them that their mind works in the same way. When they're calm for a few moments, their thoughts will settle and they will see clearer. So yes, the mindful jar, it's wonderful. And of course, even just having it there in the room after you've used it is this sort of visual reminder to children about what you were talking about. And last few suggestions, I think there's so much you could come up with around this, but you could have a language assignment that involves your children's creating an emotions dictionary. Lovely idea. Have them look up a range of different emotions, define each emotion, put it into a sentence, write about how that emotion might show itself during this time. Set a science assignment. Ask children to research the fight, flight, freeze response. There's so much information out there. I think it's something that children could get a lot out of. Involve them in creating posters that can be put up around the classroom, and encourage children to use the emotion, to explore their emotions using the metaphor of weather. This is one of my favourite ones. I think children really take to this. So you can have children name, are you feeling cloudy today, stormy, rainy, clear, sunny? And of course, the important bit is to let them know it's okay to have many seasons in one day. They won't get stuck in a storm forever. The sun will shine again. And when we're looking at sort of resources you can use to help with this idea of the metaphor of weather and emotions, there's a wonderful book called My Inside Weather. It's a free children's book. It's available on the website book-org, where there are hundreds of free children's books, and it explores emotions through the metaphor of weather, through the eyes of this young girl, and it's absolutely brilliant. There's also, of course, the Gottman Institute. Dr. John Gottman came up with the idea of emotion coaching, so that is well worth a visit. I mentioned Dan Siegel earlier, who coined the phrase "name it to tame it." Lots of great ideas in his book there, The Whole Brain Child. We've produced a document called Transition, Recovery and Learning in the Aftermath of a Pandemic, which is full of great resources and ideas about supporting children at this current time. That is on our website, Services to Schools. And last thing to mention, our service has produced a document all about sleep during the coronavirus pandemic. But to be honest, the tips in there for adults and for children about healthy sleep hygiene is full of information. It's relevant, whether we're in the pandemic or we're not in the pandemic. And the reason why I'm mentioning sleep here is because, of course, we all know that when we're not sleeping well, when we don't get a good night's sleep, when our sleep is disturbed, we really struggle to regulate our emotions and feelings much more. We can become snappy, irritable, all of those things. So sleep is actually really key in this if you've got a child struggling with their emotions. One thing you want to look at is, how are they sleeping? Are they going to bed at an appropriate time? And all those things. I'm going to finish there. I really appreciate you joining me to listen to this and go through this webinar together. Thank you very much. Take care and stay well.
We hope you enjoyed this short introduction to helping children to understand and manage their feelings. This was one of 4 webinars which are free and accessible to everyone via the Services to Schools website. You will find a link to the website and other titles in the series in the description below. If you are interested in finding out more about this topic or any of the topics covered within the series, please speak to your School Link EP, or alternatively, you can use the Contact Us button on the Services to Schools website. Thank you for listening.